Thanks for tuning in to the Drive On podcast, where we talk about issues affecting veterans after they get out of the military. Before we get started, I'd like to ask a favor. If you haven't done so already, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. If you've already done that, thank you. These ratings help the show get discovered so it can reach a wider audience. And while you're there, click the subscribe button so that you get notified of new episodes as soon as they come out. If you don't use Apple Podcasts, you can visit driveonpodcast.com/subscribe to find other ways of subscribing, including our email list. I'm your host, Scott DeLuzio, and now, let's get on with the show. Hey everyone, today my guest is Lynn Christian, who is the founder of an organization called Soul Salt. You might recognize Lynn from last week's episode where we talked about figuring out what your core values are, why it's important to know your core values, and how knowing all of that helps us make decisions that are true to ourselves. I'd encourage you to go back and give that episode a listen if you haven't done so already. And you can find out more about Lynn and her background and what she does in that episode. Today, though, we're going to talk about how we can reinvent our career paths. And this, I think, will be a dive into something that is especially important to service members as they transition out of the military and back into civilian life. So I think we're all familiar with the concept of reinventing a career. There's many examples of famous people who have done it. Ronald Reagan and Arnold Schwarzenegger were actors before getting into politics. Jeff Bezos worked in computer science and finance before launching Amazon. I could probably come up with dozens of more examples like this, but we get the point. The problem, though, is that it might look easy to reinvent your career when you look at some of these celebrity examples. But in reality, it's not always that easy. So, Lynn, welcome back to the show. Let's jump right in and talk a little bit about why people have such a hard time when they pivot in their careers.
Scott, that's a great question, and it's an astute observation that it looks easy. When you see somebody else doing a jump from a career, they reinvent, they're doing something different, it looks incredibly easy from the outside, just like social media makes people look like their lives are 100 times better than they probably are. And the truth of it is there are some dynamics going on that make it so that it's far more daunting, and yet it's doable. It takes courage, it takes determination, and it takes a few strategies. Here are some of the reasons why it's difficult. Number one, a lot of us don't realize, but it has to do with our neural networks. So imagine something that you're really good at that you now don't even have to think about, like brushing your teeth, tying your shoes, driving to work. Those kinds of things are habits. And when we are working toward a new identity, we actually have to think differently. We have to behave differently. We have to have confidence in ourselves that we can do those other things. So that's one of the biggest milestones is in our head. Another one is we don't always get into the prefrontal cortex, which is the executive brain right here behind the third eye chakra in your forehead, and see what else is possible. We see other people doing things, but we're not often encouraged to see what's possible for us. And if we do see what's possible for us, we often then critique it immediately. Well, I don't know how I can make a living at that. And so a lot of it is really, it sounds trite, but it's in our head. We really mess ourselves up with our thought patterns. So that's one thing. How's that?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you probably could narrow down quite a few problems that we have, just people in general have it's a lot of it's in your head, and you psych yourself out sometimes trying to figure out how to do things or whatever. I'm no stranger really to reinventing my career.
Right.
Since I started working at age of 16 over 20 years ago now, I've had about 11 different jobs. Now, some of those were temporary, like beer money type jobs during college, so maybe it's not fair to include those in the mix. Others were working concurrently, so it's not like I just worked for a year or two and then quit. But the other jobs were more, the professional jobs that people start working at right after college, and they stick around sometimes throughout retirement. They have that one job for their entire career. For me, though, I became dissatisfied with the work that I was doing I started to lack the enthusiasm for the job, and it became harder and harder to get out of bed in the morning to go to work. And I know I made some mistakes when reinventing my own career, when I was changing those jobs. But what are some of the mistakes that people oftentimes make, and maybe even incorporate? How does someone's values tie into this whole equation?
Well, let's talk about the mistakes first
Sure.
and what to do about them, and then let's talk about the core values. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So one of the mistakes that we make is what you just mentioned. A lot of people don't do what you just did, Scott. Sometimes you have to look back to look forward. So if you look back and go, oh, look, I did this when I was 16, I did this when I was 17, and you just discounted that you did something because you just needed beer money. Okay, that is a skill to be able to just say, I'm just going to go get a job because I need some cash.
Mhm.
That's a skill you can use during reinvention, because even though you may not make a jump from where you are right now to that perfect landing spot that will be your next career, you're going to need what I call bridges and ladders to get you to a place where you're earning an income and you have some space where you can start to reinvent. So if you look to your past, from the very first time you had a job to where you are now, you can see that you've done many things. Even if you've only been, say, in the Army, or if you've only been with one corporation, or you've only been with three, what were some of your roles? You didn't stay stagnant. And the fact that you were able to transform, that's one of the mistakes we make, is not seeing how adaptable we are as human beings and not realizing that within each person are many possible selves. The self that shows up and is bartender is one self. The self that is willing to go and volunteer at a preschool and help children learn how to make kites is another self. So you look at these possible selves instead of thinking, I am this one person and maybe I can do 12 things with my life. It's like, oh, you're many sorts of opportunities inside of you because you have strengths, you have values, you have aspirations, you have a number of things. It's like a big giant gumball machine full of different material that could be dispensed and put together to form a new shape, and you could do that shape for 5 years, and then you go back to the drawing board and you want a different color and a different shape to do something else for 10. So that's one of the mistakes. Another mistake is thinking, okay, so I've been in the Army and I did this and this and this. Now I don't know what to do with myself. Well, college students are a lot like that. Attorneys are a lot like that. It's really hard for you to spend so much time getting trained and then thinking that that leads to a linear path, as I learned this skill and this skill and this skill, so now this is what I can do. We think that's a linear path. And to prove that, I'm just going to give you some majors that people could study in college and a job. And you just tell me, Scott, does it make sense? Was there a linear path from what they studied to what they ended up doing?
Sure.
Okay, so one individual studied art. Would it make sense that a job they could have is to be a cartoonist?
Sure.
Okay. Another person maybe studied Asian American studies. Would it be plausible that they could teach English as a second language in Korea?
I could make that connection.
Okay. Another person who studied chemistry, could you see them going on to be a veterinarian?
Potentially, there probably would need to be some
Right.
additional studies there. So, I mean, they're in the sciences, so I can sort of see that.
Psychologist, somebody who studies psychology could become a psychotherapist. Could you see that?
Yeah,
Yeah. And somebody who studied geography could become a high school geography teacher.
certainly. Yeah.
Okay. So now that makes sense. And that's kind of how we think. That's one of the
Mhm.
mistakes we make, is thinking we have to connect the dots in this linear pattern. But the truth is, the person who studied art ended up as a special prosecutor in a district attorney's office. The person who studied Asian American studies became a bond trader on Wall Street. The chemists decided they didn't like the sciences. They went to Korea and started teaching English. The geography major became an editor at a major publishing house. The psychologist became the cartoonist, and particularly political cartoons. So
I can see
if you,
that.
yes, so so that one came out of a little bit out of left field, but you can still
Yeah,
see that. And so
sure.
so one of the mistakes we make is being too logical.
Yeah.
And the thing we want to do is instead of being logical, be experimental. The path of reinvention, a mistake we make is thinking our way there, thinking, okay, if I just think hard enough, if I just stay in my head long enough, I'll figure it out. The truth is, you have to experiment with it. You have to discover. You have to not know. You have to be like a kid.
Hmm.
Go into the toy room and play with some of the toys and see which ones you like. Go to the smorgasbord and taste some of the food and see which ones you like. We have to experiment and discover and not know before we can finally have it distill upon us what's that next move. So, how do core values come into this? Core values play a big part because I again would have to say they can stand as your anchor. Those can stand as a compass. You wouldn't even want to start exploring uh, fields of study, crafts, trades. You wouldn't want to look at job opportunities that pull you out of your integrity.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good point too, because you might be looking at a job where, you mentioned, I don't tend to get into politics here, but you might mention, or might think of someone who, has a particular skill. Maybe it's, in marketing or something like that. And there's a political campaign that goes against their beliefs and their values. That's hiring a marketing director type person.
Right.
That wouldn't make a great job for them because it's going to probably eat them up inside that they're promoting this candidate that is against all of the things that or yeah, going against all the things that they're for, and or vice versa, and that probably wouldn't be a great opportunity. They wouldn't be very fulfilled or very happy with that type of job.
Right.
um, and it's hard too because a lot of times people put on a their work face and then their home face and then their friends face, and they have all these different personas, and they sort of tie all of that into who they are. But it's hard when you do that, when you're trying to juggle all these different personas. It's much easier if you're just being true to who you are, and just keep that active. And I think
Yeah.
a lot of times, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that and your values
Mhm.
are adaptable, so they're multifaceted. They're not going to be a hard. There's only a limited amount of jobs you could do. That if you really know your values, you can see ways that your values might adapt to another, even if it's a bridge job for a short term. Like I have a client who stopped becoming a professional piercer and he has a dream to open up a coffee shop. So he's working at a local bar that is known for their beer and burgers. And he is in alignment with working there because he knows that it's hospitality and he's
Hmm.
learning something for the future. So he can see he's aligned, and he didn't even think that his values would fit in with, because he actually doesn't drink, would
Okay.
fit into a bar and burger joint in the interim. But he's learning the hospitality and what it's like. Someday he'll be a barista. Well, they've now asked him to be a bartender. So he's elevating himself because he can see a connection between what he values most and what they need from him.
Yeah. And I like the examples that you gave earlier too about the different careers where you wouldn't necessarily see some of these people making that jump from one career to another. And I'm thinking of myself actually in this, where if you looked at me back when I was in college studying for an accounting degree, you wouldn't expect that I would have became a soldier, and now I do web development and software development. And none of that has anything to do really with the degree that I earned in accounting. But I was able to kind of take some of those leaps and kind of experiment, like you're talking about, to figure out what I was good at and what I enjoyed doing, throughout my career, which I'm fortunate that I was able to make some of those leaps. But the first job I had out of college was in accounting. It was for a CPA firm, and when I towards the end of my time at that job, I didn't think too far outside of the box, to try to figure out, um, what my next move would be. And so I ended up in corporate finance. So it wasn't that
Mm,
big of a stretch. It was still, in
yeah,
the financial area. So, I wasn't thinking much further than that general realm of finance, which actually significantly limited the type of jobs that were available to me. Had I thought something a
right.
little bit more broad, I would have had a lot more jobs that were available to me.
Well, Scott, can we break that down just a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
So, another mistake that we make when we're reinventing, and I know this, you know this, you've done it, I've done it, I've reinvented at least 7 times. Here, here is one of the main things that people get concerned about. They get worried that they're wasting their time, their energy, and their money that they put into their degree.
Mhm.
When you see where you are right now, do you feel like that you wasted your education?
No, not at all.
How
As a matter
come?
of fact, without that, I don't see that I would have gotten to where I am, because there's more to it than just the numbers in accounting, that you learn. You learn a whole lot more, by being in school and getting that education. So, um, and then the work experience that I gained over the years too. Working for various companies and seeing how they're
Mhm.
run helped me now, as an entrepreneur now, to run my own business.
Yeah, and can we go deeper into that?
Yeah.
Okay, so another example for people that are listening within your own story, really great example of what I'm talking about when I go back to that gumball machine. So we sometimes, a mistake that we make is we get into a mindset that we're just poured into this mold. Like you could have, okay, I studied accounting, so it makes sense I'm working with a finance company. But really, when we go back to where you were in those classes, there's a part of you that's deliberate, a part of you that can slow down and see the details, a part of you that can use analysis and logic. Would you agree?
Yeah.
And they afforded you the opportunity to understand the field of accounting and to work in the world of finance. If we go back to those seminal pieces of you, deliberate, you probably see patterns as well, logical, all of those things that we just mentioned are feeding your ability to work in web development.
Hmm.
So that's what I'm talking about is when we look at ourselves as possible selves instead of jobs or roles or some kind of name on an org chart for what your title was. And we go back to what are you able to do? How do you think? How do you respond? Those things can always translate into something else. Does that
Hmm.
make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Um, and I think a lot of times, when you're talking about that mold, I think that's a good example where people feel like they have to fit in this mold. A lot of times people sort of feel like they become tied to their identity, of what they do. This
Hmm.
might go back to the point of, why people have a hard time when they try to pivot in their careers. But people will say I'm an engineer, and I'm an electrician, I'm a plumber, the same way that they might say I'm a human. Right. That
Right.
last one you can't change. But we
Right.
think of our careers almost in the same way, where we tie that to our identity, who we are. We don't feel like we can change it, no matter how miserable maybe we might even be with the job that we're doing. But we feel like we're stuck because I'm that plumber or accountant or lawyer or whatever the job may be. So how can we break that bond between our career and our identity? How do we allow ourselves to kind of let go of that?
Yeah, there's probably an answer for that for every person because we can do it in a unique way. But I can give strategies and then
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
can apply this. Um, so, one of the ways to give yourself some time, I call them the 3 R's of reinvention. The first R is revealing your best self to yourself, identity, your core values. And when I say best self to yourself, it's like, okay, when did somebody give you a challenge, a formal challenge, and you took it on and you beat it? Okay, what was it activated then? That's a reflection of your best self. Maybe there were challenges that were informal. Maybe you had a friend and you were supporting them and you guys understand, let's say for you, for instance, Scott, you understand what it's like to transition after being in the services.
Hmm.
So you go to show up for this friend because she's giving a speech at a local community event and you find out she has laryngitis. And she writes on a napkin, please tell them, please speak to them. You do the speech. And you find out that you really love it and that you were really good at it and people got value. All of a sudden, you see another part of you. You know, maybe you see that you can think on the fly, or maybe you're really passionate about the topic, whatever it reveals to you. So the first step is spending time revealing identity to yourself.
Okay.
Noticing when people have acknowledged you and given you praise and noting that. Notice when you felt strong and you want to go do more activities like that. Keeping a list of pieces of you that are your best reflected self. In fact, it's such a thing as RBS, reflected best self, not to
Okay.
be mistaken with RBF, which is something else, but RBS is reflected best self. And then after you've reflected on that, take those elements and go to the next star, which is research, which can take the form of an experiment, a discovery, an adventure. Go out and do something. Go volunteer, take a part-time job, pull out a project. I have a reinventor right now from France, and she's actually making a small project out of creating a product she's going to sell at a local farmer's market. And she may even get some crowdfunding for it. So she's experimenting with this piece of her that is making a product that has a cause and also her entrepreneurship. So she's out there playing with this microcosm. She doesn't have she just has a DOB. She doesn't have an entity, a business. She doesn't know if she's going to be an entrepreneur. She has a full-time job. So she's researching, experimenting, discovery. And then after you do that, give yourself some reflective time. Sometimes we don't know who we are till we see what we've done. And sometimes we need people to reflect to us, what was the value of what we did? Who did you see active? How did this help you? So we do some reflection. We go back, put this all together, add it to sort of what we know about ourselves, have another revelation of what else we can do or how to extend that first experiment, and then do another cycle of research and reflection. So it's reveal something to yourself, let it occur to you, do some research through experimentation and trying, even finding other people. I have someone who reinvented into, she now owns a pole and dance studio. What happened was she saw a pole dancer that was competitive, who was earning a medal at a competition. And she was like, I'm going to use my gymnastic and my dance background, and I'm going to do that someday. I'm going to be number one. And she was. And 5 years later, she worked up to becoming the gold medalist at a United States event in pole dancing. Today, she has a studio. So she had to reflect, and it wasn't some piece of herself that she reflected at. 10% of our goals may come from seeing somebody doing something that interests us. So
Right.
she put some attention toward that. She did research on it. She played with it. She accomplished something. She came back and reflected and went, what does that tell me? Should I keep competing? No. Now I want to put my dance and my pole together and create a studio. So it's a cycle where you do months, years. I mean, honestly, that's another mistake, that we think we can just do it in a snap. You can get a bridge job in a snap, but to reinvent, the fastest I've had a reinvention client do it is 6 months. And you can imagine why. You don't want to just jump out of the frying pan into a fire and find out the next thing you jumped into, you don't like any better.
Right. Yeah, and I think that was maybe one of the mistakes that I made. At least during one of the career transitions that I made
Yeah.
was, it was more that I was running away from a job that I didn't like than it was me running to a job that was maybe offering a more promising, career for me, or a better experience, better, uh, you know, work environment, whatever the issues were that I had. It was probably more of running away from the old job and just whatever's available, let me grab this, type of thing. So yeah, it was very much like, jumping out of the pot right into the fire. And turned out it wasn't much better,
Yeah.
where I was going to.
Well, And maybe too, we can reframe that. Maybe it was a mistake, and maybe it was
Mhm.
just a reiteration. Yeah, I'm really sure I don't want to work like this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's certainly positive aspects of that, and I was able to reaffirm basically that that was not the type of work that I was interested in. Sure, it was for it was a similar job for a different company, but it wasn't exactly the my cup of tea, and it wasn't what I wanted to really be doing. So at least I know now, not to
Right,
make that same mistake again.
right.
So there's certainly a positive spin to that we can take away from there.
Well, and
Um,
I think that's a good point too, because we are going to make some misfires. Like one of
yeah,
my jobs was to become a real estate agent because I thought I could do it on the side, earn some more cash, still raise my children, have my day job. And when I got into it, I couldn't know until I had listed and sold 3 homes just like that, really quickly. I really didn't like it. And I didn't want to be on call by people. I was like, oh, not for me. So I could
right.
have said mistake. However, I learned I could be really good at taking tests and getting through a course part time, which helped me later on to get my PMP, my project management certification, later when I needed that to raise my kids with a project management office. So I think that's the other thing is to your audience, if you have the growth mindset and you don't see things as failure, but you see them as I didn't reach my goal yet, the warrior in you has to always be learning. And if you go in, and I know this from my own combat arts as a fencer, the warrior in us has to constantly learn. If we go in just to win and think there's a win or a loss, and we will land on one side or the other, we limit ourselves to the opportunities of what every experiment gives us. So approach every experiment, every part of reinvention, like the warrior, as a learning experience, not a win-loss.
Yeah, that's a great way to think of it. Everything good or bad you can learn from. Whatever experiences you go through, they could be complete and utter failures on the surface, but if you and they are if you don't learn something from it. If you don't succeed at whatever it is that you try, and you don't learn from that mistake, and you go and you do it again, kind of like I did when I switched that career. um you know that probably wasn't the best outcome, but now that I've learned from that, I was able to take that away, and now I'm able to have that positive side to it, where I at least have that knowledge now, knowing that
Right,
that's not the career path I really want to go back to uh,
right.
down the road. So let's go now to more specific to the service members, the military people who are now transitioning out of the military. Their time in the service is over, and now they're becoming civilians all over again. And I've talked to several veterans on the show who've struggled with that same transition, and that they felt like they couldn't let go of that past that they've had, in the military, um, and they struggle to kind of find that new career. What is it that I'm good at? As an infantryman, there's no real civilian jobs that directly correlate. Like we were talking before. With the college degrees and the jobs. And an artilleryman isn't exactly going to have a civilian occupation that's going to have the same uh, uh, same type of qualifications or whatever. But you do learn a hell of a lot when you're in the military.
Yes, you
And
do.
it's more than just your job. So what would be some of the advice that you might have for people who are reinventing themselves, transitioning from that military to civilian career?
One thing I would do is to make a one pager. I'm borrowing this from a gentleman who was a drug dealer and smuggled drugs globally. He was in charge of millions and millions of dollars of budget, international security. He could hack international security codes, working with people across the globe. And finally, he spent time in prison. And when he got out, his wife was like, "You need to go get a job. You're driving me crazy." And he said, "Who's going to hire me? I mean, I don't know how to do anything. I've spent time in prison. So I'm going to, if somebody's limited, that guy, you could see logistically why he might feel limited."
Right.
His wife gave him a challenge that I'm going to give your audience. I'm going to modify the challenge just a little bit. She said, "Go ahead and list out all the things that you can do. Like, you did run a budget. You did hack NSA. You did do this. You did do that." And so what he did is he put it together, and then they posted it. I think he was in Toronto. He posted it in the Toronto Post, or their big newspaper. And he had a ridiculous, like, it was like 1,600 people calling him wanting to hire him. So here's the modification. Take all these things that you know you can do, pieces of your identity. Don't try to put them into a career. Do what this guy did. Place them as skill sets, talents, things that you like, things that you've been told you're good at, and make a one-pager. And then meet somebody for coffee or meet somebody for lunch, or post it on your Facebook page and say, "If you were in my shoes, who would you talk to? I
Mhm.
need to find a job, or I need to do some sort of reinvention. Who would hire me?" Because other people's imaginations will see your possibilities. I even think attorneys who've been working, I've recently worked with a trademark attorney who was just, I call it, almost crippled in the brain, like we can be when we've only done this in the Army. We've only been in the Army, and I'm using quotation marks, air quotation marks. It's like, oh, hell, don't say that to me. That's
Right.
not an only, the
Yeah.
character, the courage that goes behind that. You can't train that. That comes with you. And
Mhm.
that's more valuable to me than skill. So if we get into those mindsets where we can only do this thing, we don't see opportunity. It's just as hard for this patent attorney to reinvent as it would be for somebody coming out of the Army, because your brain's in that hamster wheel of, I can just do this and I'm
Right.
really good at it and I can earn money doing this, but now I can't because I want to do something different. So create a one pager, get other people to talk to you about it. Another thing you can do is join a group that's reinventing, because they may know other things. At Soul Salt, we have groups. We actually have one happening right now where people come in and we hold their hand for 30 days at a time, and they create. Right now, we're just working on identity. What else do you have in there besides the things that you thought you've always used day in and day out? And who are you at your core? We spend 30 days on that. The next thing we're going to do is spend 30 days on finding out what we're good at and strong. Then we're going to start spending the next 30 days doing experiments with those things. So your audience could do that just from hearing me.
Mhm.
30 days, revealing identity, find those core values, go back to the last episode, get in the show notes, find out how to do that. Then find out, what are your strengths? Where are you strong? Where are you working from? And I'm using this metaphorically, from muscle, where you love doing what you're doing and you're good at it. And then the next 30 days, spend some time putting experiments together based on those things that you found out about yourself. Try some ludicrous things. I once had a managing editor from Reuters of North America decide that what she was going to do, because she'd been a journalist, but she loved paper, she loved writing, she decided to make cards. So she spent a year in her reinvention making cards. She still makes cards, and she's founded a volunteer group that makes cards for people's shut-ins during the holidays. That's not sustaining her with her livelihood, but that became a hobby that she found. So those are just some ideas. Does that help, Scott?
Yeah, I think it does. And sometimes I want to go back to something that you said here, but sometimes people uh, get in that mindset of that I was just in the military, or I whatever,
Mhm.
like you had said, alluded to earlier, and they don't think of all the other things, like outside of their job, whether they're military police, or they're in finance, or whatever their job is in the military. They don't think of, outside of that, all the other experiences that they had. I've given the example of someone who might administer like a drug test, like a urinalysis kind of test,
Right.
as part of their job. They might be something else. That's not their specific job, but they were part of the group of people who were administering that test, while they're in the military, right? That goes to show that they had integrity, that they weren't
They
going
could be
to,
trusted.
that they can be
Right.
definitely that they can be trusted, because they're not going to allow somebody to, cheat on that test, that drug test, and that they, had those types of values. So, thinking outside of the box of all the other things, that you've done, sometimes you might sign out military equipment that might be worth millions of dollars, and so you're responsible for millions of dollars worth of, military equipment, whether it's a, vehicle, or, some other equipment. um, you can be trusted with that type of stuff. So, I think that's a big thing to include in that list, is stuff like that, where you look at all of the different things that you have done throughout your career, no matter how small you might think they are. Signing out a vehicle that might have $1 million worth of equipment in it,
Right.
might just seem like, well, I'm just doing my job. Well, so what? Like, yeah, you're doing your job, but you also are responsible for that equipment as well. So that's a big thing, and I think people undervalue that aspect of the military experience.
Yes, I think so too. And I want your audience to hear this. Those of us in the civilian world, look at what you've done. And when you break down, I mean, those things sound really badass to us. They're not even things we'd even dream somebody did. We
Right.
didn't even think about it. And it's like, oh, well, that's cool. Well, if you can manage a budget there, or if you can be trustworthy to handle those tests, yeah, there's something inside of you. Yeah, let's look and see what we might have in our company that would
Hmm.
fit that. It's it's like the prophet is always rejected at home, and we reject our own profitability in what we've done in the past in the army, because we can't see the link between what we did and somebody else's sense of value. So
Yeah.
you have to get out of your own way, because again, I'll tell you, as a civilian, anytime I talk to a veteran and they tell me the things they did, I'm like, whoa.
Right. Yeah, it becomes commonplace because it's just what everyone does when they're in the military, and that's unfortunately the, sort of the attitude that people end up having is that, oh, it's just part of the job. And so of course I did that because I sort of had to, that was my job at the time.
Yeah,
But don't undervalue it, I guess, is the message that I'm trying to get across there.
precisely.
So, Lynn, it's been great having you on the show again. We're coming up on time, and it seems like time just flies by when we get to
It
talking
does.
here. But could you remind people where they can go to find out more about you and your organization, for anyone who maybe didn't listen to the last episode?
Yeah, so we can be found on our website, which is soulsalt, SOULSALT.com. We're in Salt Lake City. You can find us online on our website. We do have a lot of blogs about reinvention. You can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. And you can also follow me, LYN, just one N in Lynn, and Christian, CHRISTIAN. I'm mostly on Instagram, but I do occasionally post on Facebook. And then every Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock typically, Mountain Time, we do a Facebook Live. We've talked often about some of these topics that I'm talking to you about. And of course, if you missed those when it's live, you can also go back and just find them on our Facebook page.
All
Oh,
right.
and we also
Well,
have a Soul Salt Coaching, all one word, Soul Salt Coaching. We have a YouTube channel that people could subscribe to and get our latest videos.
perfect. And we'll have links to all of that in the show notes, and so that you can click there and go subscribe and find Lynn in all the places on the internet that she hangs out. So thank you again for being on the show, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Drive On Podcast. If you want to check out more episodes or learn more about the show, you can visit our website, driveonpodcast.com, or on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Drive On Podcast.